The Field of 68 Media Network presents Red is the New Orange, a Syracuse basketball podcast.
Vince intercepts a pass, breakaway for the freshman guard, he flies and slams! Aerial assault from Judah Mintz.
Looking to go back door to Bell, they get it to a near corner three, knocks it down! Chris Bell, the sharpshooter.
Bringing you everything you need to know out of the 315.
Up top, Williams surges ahead, up with the right hand and in. A pretty up and under move from Benny Williams to beat his man.
Over to Taylor, he skips into the lane, puts up a floater, it drops in.
Let's get it started with your host, Ian Unsworth and Johnny Gadamowitz.
Well, another Syracuse ACC conference game in the books, and unfortunately for the Orange, they come up short again, 90-74 at the hands of the Florida State Seminoles. It was part of just a loaded Saturday across the college basketball world. By the way, I'm Johnny, he's Ian. Make sure you give us a follow on Twitter at F68_Qs or X, whatever you want to call it. We don't need to open that can of worms. But Ian, a busy weekend across the college hoops world. Our friends at the Field of 68 have you covered after dark and any other podcast you could possibly want. Big time program. There's a decent chance there's a Field of 68 podcast on it. So whoever your school of preference is, they've got you covered. And it hits the point in the year now where these conference matchups, really every weekend, it is a loaded slate. We got our first true taste of that this past Saturday as majority of the Power Four, I think all of the Power Four conferences at this point are now in conference play. And by next weekend, I think every single conference period will be pretty much conference play the rest of the way. So an exciting time of year. And now we really start to see where teams start to, stand amongst the pack relative to the rest of their conference opponents. That includes the Syracuse Orange, who lose to Florida State, drop now to 6-8, 2 games under 500, 0-3 in ACC play. And Ian, this was a game that didn't really have a ton of bad, I guess you could say, is an interesting way of framing it. Only down by 2 at the break, and then Florida State just really picked up the pace from an offensive standpoint in the second half, and Syracuse just couldn't really go punch for punch with them.
54 second half points. That's the key number. That's if you're looking at this game and you want a padlock stat, the stat that defines the game, that is it. 54 points in the second half. Johnny, I think you hit the nail on the head too when you said that Florida State sped up in the second half, picked up the pace, and outran Syracuse up and down the floor. Florida State can do that because they have more depth. There are guys 8th, 9th, 10th off the bench, and we talked about this, that gave the Seminoles more energy. I mean, take Boston Holt, for example. We didn't talk about him before the game. He's not someone that was probably highlighted or underlined on the scouting report, but he played 9 solid minutes and gave Florida State 5 points. And most of those came in the second half when Florida State had its bench unit on the floor for a large chunk of time. There were probably 6 or 7 minutes where Daquan Davis, Jameer Watkins, Malik Ewan were all sitting. Not a problem, because Florida State turned defense into offense and pushed the pace. For Syracuse, turning it over 15 times, not a problem, right? Getting out rebounded 36-34 is not really a problem. And you look at the second half shooting numbers, and I mean, they're not that bad. 52% from the field is not that bad. 7 of 12 from 3. I mean, you'll take that any day. But Florida State won this game. Syracuse did not necessarily lose this game because they made a bunch of blunders. We've seen that before. But Florida State won this game because they were more sound with their identity, which is beating you up and down the floor and then not letting you get in the paint with their length. And I thought that was what really stifled Syracuse in the second half. Yeah, the threes came along, but the Orange could not get to the bucket against the 7-foot bigs. Taylor Bowen had a heck of a game. He was a massive factor in preventing Syracuse from getting inside and then starting those transition breaks, which led to 54 second half points.
I think that's what almost, for me at least, kind of makes it all the more frustrating, is that, look, there have been losses this year where so much did not go right, where you could point to issue number 1, issue number 2, issue number 3, and say, hey, this is why Syracuse lost. To your point, Ian, I didn't get that vibe a ton from this game. Like, there were a lot of good things that happened.
Yeah.
We haven't even mentioned the fact that JJ Starling returned to the lineup,
Mm-hmm.
played well, and was not limited. 32 minutes of action. Now, he didn't have his best game, was
No.
only 5 of 16 from the floor, but believe he was the leading scorer at the halftime break. Ended up being Donnie Freeman, who finished with the double-double, 16 and 10.
Chris
But
Bell,
for
18
me,
as well, off the
and
bench.
Chris Bell, another point, right? Knocks down 4 3-pointers, right? So a lot of things that we've been kind of chirping about of, hey, we want to see this. We want to see the Orange get back to this. Occurred, and still you come up short, which for me, the takeaway is, okay, what really is the ceiling of this team? I'm not sure it's very high because you checked a lot of boxes. You did what you needed to do. You got that, sort of identity back. And still, we're not talking about a 2 point loss. We're talking about a double-digit loss. That's a tough pill to swallow.
A lot of guys played well. Lucas Taylor played well, played solid defense. Kyle Cuff chips in double digits off the bench. Majstorovic has 7 boards. Both those guys foul out, but still, you're not really concerned about the 8th and 7th guy, 8th guy off your bench. Well, actually, these guys are probably more like 9 and 10.
Right.
You're not concerned about them fouling out. That's not a problem. It just means they left it all out there. And Majstorovic certainly does that. Kyle Cuff certainly does that. The team looked like it played together. The team didn't really give up. Besides Chris Bell, who kind of lost his mind a couple times at the bench, it looked like this team was together. Lucas Taylor picked up one of his trademark technicals. I think that is something we just have to expect at this point. He's got 4 on the year, and Syracuse now has played 14 games, and Lucas Taylor wasn't a factor in about 4 or 5 of them. So he's got 4 technical fouls in 10 games. Might be a trend, might not. Either or. A lot of positives to point to. Johnny, for me, the biggest of all the positives is Donnie Freeman really building some confidence in this game. This was not a game where I thought Donnie Freeman would have a good game. Because you think about it, what is his calling card? Length and athleticism. He can shoot over people. He can excel by beating smaller guys or taking bigger guys on the perimeter. You don't really do that against Florida State.
Yeah.
Florida State's guys are bigger than you. They are longer than you. And usually they cover more ground than you. But Donnie Freeman, against dudes his size, held his own. He got his buckets inside, some tough turnaround fadeaways, right? A couple of tough rebounds, a putback and one. 16 points and 10 rebounds against dudes that have played college basketball for 2, 3, 4 years. Really impressive. And he looks steady too. I don't think he's much of an emotional player. Like, we're not going to see him rah-rah and, pumping his fist, but he never got rattled. He never looked out of sync or out of place. And I think there have been times this year where he takes a back seat.
Was not the case against the Seminoles. And you look at the last couple of games for Donnie, and he has started to turn a corner.
Mm-hmm.
Take out the Wake Forest game, he's scored double figures in 3 of his last 4, double doubles in 2 of the last 3, which is what you want to see, right? Hitting your stride when the games really start to count and really start to matter. Unfortunately, though, it hasn't really spread to the rest of the roster. More specifically, Elijah Moore. The Elijah Moore experiment, and I don't know if experiment is necessarily the right word, but the roller coaster of a season that Elijah Moore has endured continues to take another unexpected twist in as he plays only 3 minutes. First couple games of the season, he was one of the bigger bright spots. It was, oh boy, Freeman, Moore, we could really have something here. And now these past couple of games, Red Autry, for whatever reason, just doesn't really appear to have that level of trust. I think a lot of it probably stems from the defensive end. And we've talked about the defensive lapses that this team has had, and Moore is certainly plenty guilty in that regard. But I almost want to push back on it a little bit and say that, okay, look, it's growing pains, right? You've got to be willing to kind of embrace those ebbs and flows. Not to say the pros outweigh the cons and you got to play them 25, 26 minutes a game. No. But how are you going to expect those strides to be taken when he's barely seeing the court? I think he's shown us enough to a point where he should be involved in the rotation way more than he has been over the course of these past couple.
Well, here's a quote from Red Autry after the FSU game about Elijah Moore. Red said, I think for him, he needs to continually improve on the defensive side of the ball. And on the offensive side of the ball, he has to look to be aggressive and limit the turnovers. That's what's going to help. We need his ability to shoot. I'm paraphrasing here. If you want the full quote, Justin Gershon, one of the Daily Orange's basketball beat writers, transcribed the entire thing. But play better defense, limit the turnovers while being aggressive, which is tough for a freshman because in high school, he's used to putting his head down and getting whatever he wants. Right. He can spin, he can go through the legs behind the back. No one's going to check him. It's a lot different when you're playing the monsters of the Midway down there. But it'll come for Elijah Moore. I'm not so concerned about this. You got JJ Starling.
I'm not concerned that it's not going to come. I think, he's shown the flashes and it's about piecing it together and getting that consistency. But how can you expect him to do that if you're not willing to give him a little bit of a leash?
Well, Lucas Taylor's been playing well. Kyle Cuff's been playing well. Those guys have earned their minutes.
Right.
Rightly so. I don't think Elijah Moore has necessarily played himself completely out of the rotation. It's more the fact that these other guys have stepped up and are taking more of the mantle. And at times, like Kyle Cuff carrying the team was never something I thought we'd ever say, but it happened. And that goes for something. And yes, Elijah Moore against Tennessee carried the team too for a little while in that first half. So what do we come back to? The defensive end. And I don't think anyone is questioning Kyle Cuff's effort on the defensive end. So if Elijah Moore takes strides there, he probably works his way back in the rotation and eventually water comes level because, I think it's fair to say that Elijah Moore on the offensive end certainly has a deeper bag and can probably shoot it just as well, if not better, as Kyle Cuff.
So we'll keep an eye out for if he does indeed take those strides defensively and if he is rewarded with more playing time as a result. His next opportunity to do that comes on Tuesday against the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. Syracuse back home, ACC home game in front of the home crowd. Not quite sure if classes have resumed yet. My guess would be the second semester has not started up yet. Still feels
regardless of whether the semester started or not, they're going to have more fans than Georgia Tech had in McCamish Pavilion this past weekend. Oh my goodness. That place was emptier than a church on a Tuesday.
In a 21-point win over Boston College over the weekend at McCamish Pavilion. Jackets have rattled off a couple consecutive ACC wins. Took down Notre Dame at home on New Year's Eve and then followed it up with defeating the Boston College Eagles, like we alluded to over the weekend. I think it's fair to say, Ian, this Yellow Jackets team comes into the year without a ton of expectations. They're not necessarily a team that you're going to find towards the top of any sort of conference power ranking list, if you will, in year two now under Damon Stoudemire. But this is a Jackets team that, is, I don't know if surprised necessarily fits the bill, but 8-7, 2-2 through their 4 ACC games, and kind of, figuring it out as they get into the crux of conference play here over the course of the next couple of weeks. Not a ton of familiar names. If you're looking back to Georgia Tech teams of past, Lance Terry is their leading scorer. He checks in at about 15.5 points per game. They do have 4 guys in double figures. So again, kind of similar to Florida State. They can spread the rock and beat you in a multitude of ways, and just kind of depends on which guy is going to show up on any given day.
Yeah, there are a lot of different faces on this team that you may know if you keep up with college basketball, or maybe you watch them beat North Carolina last year and you said, oh, maybe this is a team worth watching. They got a lot of guys back, honestly, which is pretty impressive from year 1 to year 2. If you're Damon Stoudemire, keeping your dudes around definitely matters. But Georgia Tech got dealt a tough hand. First two conference games this year were against North Carolina and Duke. I mean, that's not a way you want to start. And they only lost to Carolina by 3. Now, let's be clear. Yeah, Carolina is not Carolina of years past. Like they're going through it front court wise, and it makes sense that Georgia Tech's best player happens to be Bayandongo, who is their center, who is uber athletic, who rebounds the ball like it's nobody's business, and just constantly goes after the ball. Like he is a hound for working his butt off on the glass, and he will jump over Eddie Lampkin if he has to get a rebound. But he's only 6'9". It's not like Lampkin will be outclassed size-wise like he was on Saturday against the 7-foot giants of Florida State. So there will be a way for Lampkin to get involved in this game. Then you lose to Duke by 26. You beat Notre Dame at home by double digits, and you handle Boston College. And I mean, they were up double digits on BC in the first half. Yeah. BC looks like a ragtag bunch. It might be rough waters for Earl Grant over there in a few weeks. But yeah, they did not look good. Coming on as of late for Georgia Tech, Johnny, you mentioned Lance Terry, Nathan George back for his sophomore season. Both those guys super consistent, play about 80% of the minutes in the backcourt. But someone that's really taken the mantle as of late has been Duncan Powell. Third school in 3 years, redshirt junior. He's been at Sacramento State, North Carolina A&T. So not exactly world beaters in the college basketball landscape. But last year at Sac State, averaged 12 a game, and he's really starting to find it. Double digits in 3 of his last 4. He scored 21 against Notre Dame. So he comes off the bench and really provides Georgia Tech a spark. He can shoot it. He's 6'8". He's long. He's not afraid to drive. It's kind of what Syracuse needs off the bench, honestly. But Powell will be someone to keep an eye on because he can change the tenor of the game in a moment. You also won't miss him. He's bald, but he's got a little soul patch underneath the headband he wears on the back of his head, and his arms and legs are covered in tattoos. So he's fun to watch, and he's got a personality about him.
Georgia Tech shot 59% against Boston College, and for what it's worth, was their largest margin of win in an ACC game in a couple of years since going back to 2021. So
also, for all you Siena fans out there, Javian McCollum is on this team. 2 years at Siena, transfers to Oklahoma, and now is playing his senior year at Georgia Tech. So if you're over there in Albany, you're a Syracuse fan, you'll see your familiar name on Tuesday.
Jackets are feeling themselves. Wins in 4 of their last 5. Their only loss during that span to Duke. So Georgia Tech has been handling business as of late. They'll try to continue that Tuesday night, 7 o'clock tip. You can watch it on the ACC network as the Orange try to get back in the win column. Syracuse 6-2 at home this season as opposed to 0-3 on the road. And obviously would love to grab a conference win. What would be
still without a Power 5 win at that.
Yeah. So the further along we go into 2025, obviously the worse it becomes if that still holds true. So the Orange and the Jackets coming up on Tuesday night. Of course, we will be back to break it all down at the tail end of the week and get you set for a date with those aforementioned Boston College Eagles coming up this weekend. So even if Syracuse can't find a way to defend home court, you'd think on paper, winnable game on the horizon this weekend. But we'll worry about that next time. Until then, with Ian, I'm John.